The daylight began to fade, giving way to a cold and silent night. The wind blew softly, making the dry leaves dance in the air as if they were bidding Oliver a final farewell. The atmosphere was solemn, with the distant sound of church bells echoing through the air. Family and friends were gathered in a small hall, decorated with white flowers and candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. Oliver's coffin was positioned in the center of the room, surrounded by flower wreaths and photographs capturing happy moments of his life. The air was heavy, laden with sadness and resignation. Each face present reflected the pain of loss, except for one. Julia, Oliver's wife, stood beside the coffin, her eyes not displaying the same sorrow as the others. Instead, there was a shadow of something darker, a secret she kept buried deep in her heart. While those present murmured words of consolation and memories, Oliver, against all the laws of nature and medicine, began to feel something. First, it was a sensation of warmth, a tingling in his fingers. Then, a crushing weight on his chest, as if he were trapped under tons of earth. His eyes, though closed, began to perceive flashes of light, followed by a deep darkness. Suddenly, he found himself enveloped in a mantle of confusion and fear. What was happening? Why couldn't he move? He tried to open his eyes but encountered resistance as if his eyelids were sealed. His thoughts were murky, scrambled. He tried to scream, but no sound came from his throat. With great effort, Oliver finally managed to open his eyes, only to be greeted by an oppressive darkness. He blinked several times, adjusting to the darkness around him. As his eyes adjusted, he began to perceive the shapes around him. The close wooden walls, the low ceiling, and then, the realization hit him like a bolt of lightning: he was inside a coffin. Panic set in. He tried to move, but his muscles were stiff, atrophied by immobility. With great effort, he managed to move his fingers, scratching the inside of the coffin. The sound of his nails scraping on the wood was horrifying, but it was also the only thing connecting him to the reality of his situation. He was alive. But how was that possible? He clearly remembered his last moment of consciousness, a crushing pain in his chest, and then, nothing. As his mind struggled to understand his situation, he heard muffled voices. He recognized some of them, familiar voices of people he knew and loved. But one voice stood out among them all, Julia's. He held his breath, trying to listen better. "Finally, we got rid of Oliver," Julia said, her voice laden with cold and cruel satisfaction. Oliver felt a wave of shock and disbelief sweep through his body. How was this possible? He could never have imagined that the woman he loved, his wife, was involved in something so sinister. As Julia's words echoed in his mind, he heard another voice, one he did not recognize immediately. It was a male voice, soft and insidious. "Now we can live in peace," said the man. The voice seemed full of promises and plans, as if they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Oliver felt his heart race. The betrayal was deep, and anger began to grow within him. He couldn't let this happen. He needed to get out of there. He needed to confront Julia and this mysterious man. With renewed determination, he began to pound on the coffin, his hands bruised and bleeding. Each blow was a cry of desperation, a plea for help. The attendees began to notice the muffled sound coming from the coffin. Murmurs of confusion and fear began to circulate around the hall. Julia turned pale, her eyes wide with terror. The man beside her tried to calm her, but she couldn't take her eyes off the coffin. With one last desperate effort, Oliver managed to push the lid of the coffin open. The soft candlelight flooded his face, momentarily blinding him. The hall fell into absolute silence, each person present frozen in fear and shock. Oliver sat up, his breathing heavy and irregular. He looked around, his eyes finally settling on Julia. She was pale, trembling, her eyes full of horror and guilt. The man beside her took a step back, his face a mask of panic. "Julia," Oliver said, his voice hoarse and laden with pain. "What have you done?" The room remained in sepulchral silence, everyone waiting for the answer that would forever change their lives. The room continued in silence, a stillness that seemed eternal. Everyone's eyes were fixed on Oliver, who now stood beside his own coffin, breathing heavily. His mind was in turmoil, still struggling to comprehend the betrayal and cruelty he had just discovered. Julia, paralyzed with fear, tried to compose herself, but the words seemed unable to find their way to her lips. The man beside her, Richard, stepped forward, trying to shield Julia from Oliver's furious gaze. "Julia," Oliver's voice sounded once more, this time firmer, more determined. "What have you done?" Julia finally managed to find her voice, but it was a shadow of what it used to be. "Oliver, I thought you were dead." Her voice trembled, her words coming out hesitantly. "I didn't know. I didn't know you were alive." Oliver took a step forward, his eyes burning with rage. "You didn't know?" he repeated, his voice laden with incredulity. "I heard you, Julia. I heard you say, finally, we got rid of Oliver. Julia turned pale, her hands trembling as she tried to find an answer. Richard, attempting to take control of the situation, intervened. "Oliver, listen. This isn't what it looks like. You were dead. The doctor declared it." Julia was just trying to move on. Oliver cast a cold glance at Richard. "And who are you, to speak for her? Who are you, to be here, beside my wife, while I was inside that coffin?" Richard hesitated but then raised his chin, trying to appear confident. "I am Richard. I'm a friend of Julia's. I was here to support her." "Friend?" Oliver repeated, bitterness in his voice. "A friend who helped her get rid of me." Julia finally found her courage, though her voice was still trembling. "Oliver, please, listen to me. I was desperate. When the doctor said you were dead, my world fell apart. Richard was a friend, he helped me cope with the loss. There's nothing more between us." The murmurs among the attendees began to grow, the tension in the room escalating with each passing second. Oliver looked around, seeing the faces he knew, filled with shock and doubt. He knew he needed answers, and he needed them now. "Julia," he began, his voice more controlled. "I need to know the truth. Everything. From the beginning." Julia took a deep breath, her hands still shaking. "All right," she finally said. "I'll tell you everything." She started narrating the events that led to that moment. She spoke about how Oliver had felt unwell that night, the chest pain that caused him to collapse. The panic she felt as they called the ambulance, the rush as he was taken to the hospital. The doctor who, after hours, came with the devastating news, Oliver had suffered a massive heart attack. There was nothing they could do. Oliver listened in silence, his heart tightening with every word. He remembered the pain, the darkness that followed. But then, why was he alive now? How had he come back? Julia continued, talking about the wake, how she was trying to find a way to move on. That was when Richard came into her life, a longtime friend who had recently returned to the city. He offered her a shoulder to cry on, his presence a comfort. "I was devastated, Oliver," she said, tears now streaming down her face. "I thought I had lost you forever. Richard was only trying to help me get through it." Oliver felt a pang of pain seeing Julia's tears, but doubt still gnawed at him. "And the words I heard? Finally, we got rid of Oliver." Julia looked at Richard, who seemed equally uncomfortable. "It was a moment of weakness, Oliver. I was so hurt, so lost." When Richard said that, he was referring to the pain, the suffering. "Not to you. Never to you." Oliver wanted to believe her, but something still didn't add up. He looked at Richard, his suspicion growing. "And you, Richard? What do you have to say?" Richard took a deep breath, facing Oliver's gaze. "I said it in a moment of frustration. I was trying to help Julia move on, to find peace. It was never about you, personally. I'm sorry if my words caused pain. Oliver shook his head, still trying to process everything. The room was in tense silence, everyone waiting for the next word, the next move. He knew he needed time to understand everything, to decide what to do next. I need a moment, he finally said, stepping away from the coffin and walking towards the door. I need to process all this. Julia tried to follow him, but he raised his hand, stopping her. Please, Julia. Just, give me some time. She nodded, tears still streaming down her face. Oliver left the room, the cold night air greeting him with a chilly embrace. He took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs. He needed to think, to understand how he had survived, and what this meant for his life going forward. As he walked away, he knew that the full truth was still hidden somewhere, and he wouldn't rest until he found it. Oliver walked through the dark streets, feeling the cold night air seep into his skin. His mind was in turmoil, mixing disbelief with anger and pain. Julia's revelation was shocking, but he knew there was more behind that betrayal. He needed answers, and he was determined to find them. After wandering aimlessly for a while, Oliver decided to go back home. He knew that eventually, he would have to face Julia and Richard again, but first, he needed a moment to himself, to process everything that had happened. When he arrived home, he found everything as he had left it, but it felt different. Every corner of the house seemed filled with memories and contradictory feelings. He headed to the bedroom, and upon entering, felt a pang in his chest at the sight of the bed where he had shared so many nights with Julia. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Oliver closed his eyes and tried to organize his thoughts. It was hard to believe that his wife, the woman he loved, could have planned something so horrible. But he knew he needed to stay calm and uncover the whole truth. While he was lost in his thoughts, he heard a faint sound coming from downstairs. Someone had entered the house. Rising silently, Oliver descended the stairs, ready to face anything. To his surprise, it was Julia, who had followed him home. "Oliver," she began, her voice low and pleading. "Please, we need to talk." Oliver looked at her, his eyes full of pain and confusion. "Julia, I don't know what to believe anymore. I need answers. I need to understand what really happened." Julia took a deep breath, trying to control her emotions. "I know, Oliver. I'm just as confused, but I promise I'll tell you everything I know." They sat in the living room, and Julia started explaining. "Richard and I have been friends for a long time. When you were declared dead, I was devastated. He came to support me, and over time, we grew closer. But there was never anything beyond friendship. Those words you heard, it was a moment of desperation, of frustration. They didn't mean what you think." Oliver looked at her, trying to find the truth in her eyes. "And the doctor? How could he declare me dead? This doesn't make sense." Julia shook her head, equally confused. "I don't know, Oliver. The doctor said you had a massive heart attack and there was nothing they could do. But now you're here, alive. We need to find out how this happened." Determined to get answers, Oliver decided that the first thing to do was to return to the hospital and talk to the doctor who had declared his death. Maybe there was some mistake, some misunderstanding that could clarify everything. The next morning, Oliver and Julia went to the hospital. Upon arrival, they asked to speak with Dr. Mitchell, the doctor who had treated Oliver. After a few minutes of waiting, they were taken to the doctor's office. Dr. Mitchell looked at Oliver with an expression of disbelief. "This is impossible," he murmured, looking at the papers on his desk. "I myself declared you dead. You had no vital signs, no heartbeat." Oliver felt a chill down his spine at the doctor's words. "But I'm here, Dr. Mitchell. Alive. I need to understand how this is possible." The doctor shook his head, still trying to process the situation. "There's only one logical explanation I can imagine. It's possible that a state of catalepsy occurred, a rare condition where vital signs become so weak that they are practically undetectable. But even so, it's extremely rare. Julia squeezed Oliver's hand, trying to offer some comfort. So, he wasn't really dead? Dr. Mitchell slowly nodded. It appears not. But this doesn't explain everything. We need to run some tests to better understand what happened. While Oliver underwent a series of tests, his mind kept racing. The doctor's explanation made sense to a certain extent, but it didn't completely clarify the situation. There was something more, something he couldn't yet see. After several hours, the tests were concluded, and Oliver and Julia returned home. They knew there was still much to uncover, but at least now they had a lead. As they prepared to face whatever came next, a new determination took hold of Oliver. He would not rest until he discovered the whole truth, not just about his own death, but also about the treacherous words he had heard. He knew the journey was just beginning and that the road ahead would be full of challenges and painful revelations. But with Julia by his side, he was ready to face anything. The quest for the truth would lead them to unexpected places and reveal secrets that would change their lives forever. Oliver felt exhausted but determined. The effort to walk to Lucas's car had been strenuous, but the thirst for justice gave him strength. He and Lucas headed to the police station, where Oliver recounted his entire story to the officers, including the darkest details of the plot of betrayal and attempted murder. The police, initially skeptical, began to take him seriously when Oliver revealed information that only the real Oliver would know. The commotion caused by his return from the dead was enough to launch an immediate investigation. Meanwhile, at home, Julia and Richard continued to celebrate their apparent success. The atmosphere was euphoric, but both began to feel uneasy. Oliver's prolonged absence from his wake and the lack of any news about the discovery of the body began to raise suspicions. Julia, always meticulous, tried to stay calm, but uncertainty was eroding her confidence. Hours passed, and the police, now fully engaged in the case, raided Julia's house. They found her with Richard, both surprised and indignant. The police searched the house and found incriminating evidence, including the audio recording Lucas had obtained during Julia's conversation with Richard. The meticulously planned scheme was unraveling. Oliver, still weak, arrived at the house with the police. The reunion was tense. Julia, upon seeing him, was paralyzed with shock. Richard tried to flee but was quickly apprehended. The painful and raw truth came to light. Julia tried to justify her actions, but the evidence was overwhelming. Although still hurt and betrayed, Oliver felt a strange relief at seeing justice served. Julia and Richard were arrested on charges of attempted murder and conspiracy. The news quickly spread through the town, shocking everyone who knew the couple. At the police station, as the legal formalities were being resolved, Oliver had a moment of reflection. He wondered how things had reached this point. The love he believed to be genuine had turned into a deadly farce. Oliver was advised to seek immediate medical treatment due to the poison still circulating in his body. He was taken to the hospital, where he received intensive care. The doctors were surprised by his resilience and determination to survive. The recovery would be long, but the hope of a new beginning gave him strength. Lucas visited Oliver in the hospital, bringing him some comfort. Their friendship, tested to the limit, proved unshakable. Lucas promised to help Oliver rebuild his life, and together they began to plan a future away from the darkness of the past. Months passed, and the trial of Julia and Richard became a media event. The shocking revelations and Oliver's incredible turnaround in surviving and exposing the plot attracted national attention. The courtroom was packed, and the tension was palpable. Oliver, now stronger, was present, determined to see justice prevail. Julia, arrogant and confident, maintained her innocence, but the evidence was indisputable. The trial was a spectacle of emotions, with dramatic testimonies and impactful revelations. Richard, in a moment of desperation, tried to blame Julia, but only sealed both their fates. During the trial, the motives behind the nefarious plan came to light. Julia, frustrated with her marriage, had started an affair with Richard, a co-worker of Oliver's. Their relationship quickly evolved from a casual affair to a toxic romance full of ambitions. Richard, drowning in debt and living a life of excess, saw in Julia an opportunity to solve his financial problems. Julia, in turn, felt trapped in a loveless marriage and saw Richard as an exciting escape. The two lovers began to devise a plan to get rid of Oliver. Initially, they thought of various ways to get money, but none seemed viable without raising suspicion. It was then that Richard suggested poisoning Oliver, slowly and discreetly, so that his death would appear natural. They would make it seem like Oliver had suffered a heart attack, something that wouldn't raise much suspicion due to the history of heart problems in Oliver's family. The idea was that, with Oliver's death, Julia would inherit all his assets, including the substantial life insurance policy he held. This would solve Richard's financial problems and allow the two to start a new life together, free of any obstacles. The plan seemed perfect, but they underestimated Oliver's resilience and his ability to uncover the betrayal. During the months leading up to the attempted murder, Julia and Richard acted cautiously. Richard, being an experienced pharmacist, obtained the poison without raising suspicions. They began administering it gradually, mixing it into Oliver's meals. He started feeling increasingly weak and sick but attributed it to stress and work. However, the plan went out of control when Oliver, suspicious of the constant indispositions, decided to investigate on his own. He began to observe the patterns and realized that he always felt worse after consuming certain foods. Suspicious, he scheduled an appointment with a trusted doctor, but before he could go, Julia and Richard decided to accelerate the plan and administered a lethal dose of the poison. What they did not foresee was Oliver's incredible resilience. Although he fell unconscious and was declared dead, his body fought against the poison. When Oliver woke up in the coffin and heard Julia and Richard's conversation, he understood the full extent of the betrayal and decided to use it to his advantage. Still weak, Oliver was quickly transported to the hospital after his report to the authorities. The doctors confirmed the presence of toxins in his body, corroborating his story. The evidence was irrefutable, and Julia and Richard had no way to escape justice. In court, emotions were running high. Oliver, sitting in the front row, watched as Julia and Richard faced the consequences of their actions. The judge, impressed by their cold and calculating nature, had no doubts when delivering the sentence. Both were sentenced to long prison terms, with no possibility of parole. The audience fell silent as the verdict was announced. Oliver felt a mix of relief and sadness. The woman he once loved was now behind bars, but he could finally begin to heal and move on. Julia was taken away in tears, while Richard, defeated, accepted his fate with resignation. After the trial, Oliver decided to sell the house, full of painful memories, and move to a new city. He wanted a fresh start, far from the shadows of his past. With the support of Lucas and new friends, he slowly rebuilt his life. The experience transformed Oliver, making him stronger and more resilient. He dedicated himself to helping other victims of betrayal and violence, using his story as a beacon of hope and recovery. The tragedy that nearly destroyed him became a catalyst for his redemption and purpose. In his new life, Oliver found peace and meaning. He began giving lectures on overcoming adversity and resilience, inspiring many with his story of survival and justice. His journey, marked by pain and betrayal, revealed the strength of the human spirit and the possibility of rebirth. Amidst the darkness, he found light, and in his own resilience, he discovered the key to a future of hope and renewal. Oliver, who once awoke at his own wake, was now walking toward a new dawn. His story was a powerful testament that, even in the darkest circumstances, justice can prevail, and life can begin anew.